Hi, I'm Jeff Sivens, Chair of the EarthxLaw Advisory Council, and I've been happy to be involved in a number of the law and nature series that we've done featuring prominent environmental thought leaders, and today is no different. We have an outstanding program. I'm privileged to introduce John Cruden, uh, principal at Beveridge Diamond, one of the legends of environmental law, and today he's going to interview another legend of environmental law. Take it away, John.
Jeff, thank you so much for your leadership, and thank you for EarthX for giving me the opportunity to talk with and have a conversation with one of my heroes. I think everybody needs heroes in their world, and here's somebody that in my life has stood out as an extraordinary individual in so many ways. For over a half century, Mary Nichols has been a leader in advancing environment at state, local, federal, for Republican and Democratic governors. She was the longest standing head of the California Air Resources Board. She has initiated many of the reforms in California that the Biden administration is now adopting or endorsing as a path toward environmental progress, reducing greenhouse gases, and getting international countries involved. She was supervised and personally negotiated one of the largest settlements in the history of the federal government. There's literally no one that I know at any level that has done more, accomplished more, been more seen on environmental issues in our lifetime than Mary Nichols. She's been referred to in the paper as the Queen of Green and described as the most influential environmental regulatory person in history. Mary, thank you so much for being here and giving a chance to the audience to learn something about your career and the impact that you've had on environmental progress.
Thanks, John. It's always a pleasure to sit and just receive compliments.
So I want to start. You're in California right now, but that's not where you started. You were born in Minnesota and raised in New York. And tell us something about growing up and your parents. What was that like?
Oh, sure. I was born shortly before the end of the Second World War. So I'm actually even older than a baby boomer, right? I was born in 1945. My dad had been shipped overseas and he was at the Battle of the Bulge. And my mom went home to Minnesota, where she was from, to have me. But as soon as he was discharged, my dad came back to resume his education at Cornell. He dropped out of college in order to go enlist to fight in the Second World War. And my mother was able to be with him as he traveled around the country doing training. He was an electrical engineer, which was a much in demand profession. And when he finished, actually before he even graduated with his bachelor's degree, he was being recruited by the then brand new computer industry. But he was interested in radio wave communications. So at one point during his time at Cornell, he went and spent a year up in Alaska, but the family got to go on studying the Northern Lights and their effects on communication. So it was pretty fun. My mother got her PhD before my father did, and her field was French, Spanish, Italian, Romance languages. But because of the rules that were in effect in those days at Cornell, which hopefully they're ashamed of now, they wouldn't allow two married people to be in the university teaching, even in totally different schools or departments. So she ended up being an editor for a while at the University Press, and then went down the hill to the public high school and taught languages for most of her career. And she was very proud of the fact that because of her doctorate and because of New York State's progressive policies, she actually earned more money than my father did for most of their career. So, and the two of them also sort of tag teamed in local politics. I come from a long line on both sides of very left people. My grandparents were the ones who immigrated to America, but they were, in the case of my father's family, they were communists, and my mother's were socialists. So that was a lot to argue about at the dinner table. But they ended up being, progressive Democrats. And my father served 3 terms as the mayor of Ithaca, which is one of those towns like Berkeley and Madison, Wisconsin, that are famous for pioneering progressive policies. Like in his case, he installed a clerk who was willing to allow him to marry gay people before that was allowed by the laws of New York State, but they did it in Ithaca anyway. They banned discrimination based on weight, which was so really a great cause, in my opinion. And other things. It's sounds a little bit humorous, and it's certainly, you can chuckle sometimes at things like the Ithaca currency that they created, which was a way of doing bartering in a university town where a lot of people could do very interesting things, but couldn't necessarily make money at them, and worked out ways to do exchanges. So it was an interesting, great place to grow up. But I was the first person in my family to become a lawyer. That was my distinction. My mother was
So
thrilled.
obviously, so when you went to Cornell, that was just like hometown for you. But then how did you do that? How did you go from Cornell to Yale?
Well, I did it via New York. I actually graduated early because I was ready to leave Ithaca by that point, and my junior year. And I'd been working all the way through school as a writer for the university's um, public relations and alumni news and all that sort of stuff. And my boss, who was the head of that department, was friends with the then New York bureau manager for the Wall Street Journal. And the Wall Street Journal editor, whose name was William Clabby, asked my boss if he knew of any girls who might be interested in coming and working for the journal, because they wanted to have a girl reporter. They didn't have one, and they thought that would be a good thing to do. This was in 1966. So I finished my degree and moved to New York and spent 2 years working as a reporter, reporter, and then for the Vera Institute of Justice, which is really what got me to law school. But even before that, I'd formulated the idea that I would like to be a lawyer, because I spent a summer and most of a year actually working in the civil rights movement. So I went south, and I had an opportunity to see some of the world's best lawyers at that point up close. And when I thought I'd like to go to law school, I went to see one of them, Burke Marshall, who was on the Vera Institute board, and told him of my interest. And he said, well, you better go to Yale, because that's really the only place it's worth going to. He actually did say that. And so that was the only place I applied. And luckily for me, I got in.
But during this time period now we started having the moments. We have our very first Earth Day. We have the creation of EPA, the 1970 Clean Air Act, and so somehow you find yourself in California suing Los Angeles over air problems. How did you do that?
It turned out when I got to LA that there was a new environmental law firm that was just getting started at that point. It was formed by 4 guys who all left O'Melveny and Myers, with a big LA law firm, and had gotten their first grant, and they were just about to get started. And they took me on as a law clerk, because I hadn't taken the California bar yet. So while I was studying for the bar, I was also working part-time for them. And that is also about the same time that the Clean Air Act was coming into force. And so as I was getting ready to hopefully actually launch my career as a lawyer, we were approached by the city of Riverside and the city of San Bernardino, both of which are downwind from Los Angeles and receive a daily dose of pollution that's borne in by the wind from the Pacific Ocean. And they were anxious to find a way to do something to stop this horrible assault. And so they came to us and asked us if we would sue Los Angeles. And I was assigned the job of doing the research to see if there was any way they could do that. And the answer was pretty much no. But there was this new law that said that there was uh, essentially the right to have a plan that would clean up your air and get it to make the whatever it took, efforts to achieve federal air quality standards. And if the state didn't prepare a plan that met that test, then EPA had to step in and do it. So, it was pretty clear that the state hadn't done it. They'd submitted a plan, but it said, we can't meet these federal standards because they're too strict. They're going to make us do things that are impossible, like restrict the amount of driving, and we can't do that. So, that was what they handed in to EPA. EPA basically just took it and sat on it. And so we sued EPA, and it was an open and shut case. I mean, there wasn't anything to have a trial about. It was strictly a case in summary judgment.
Well, right after that time period, so I clerked on the California Supreme Court for Stanley Mosk. The year before me, his clerk was Jerry Brown. So Jerry Brown, and because Jerry Brown's dad had appointed Stanley Moss to the bench, and so this was reciprocal, I guess, to bring him in as a clerk. Well, Jerry Brown obviously went on to do better things several different times, but on this time around, he becomes governor, and one of his appointments was must have been a very young Mary Nichols to the California Air Resources Board. Was CARB that old then? Was that a new institution?
No, CARB was actually created under Jerry's father, Pat Brown, and Ronald Reagan appointed the man who's credited with having discovered the chemical formula for smog, Dr. Ari Hagenschmidt, who was a chemical professor of chemistry, chemical engineer actually, at Caltech. And so Dr. Hagenschmidt became the first chair of the Air Resources Board. He was a crusty guy, but he didn't like smog either. The mandate of the board was essentially to deal with automobiles. They knew it was the problem that they were facing was primarily the emissions from cars, and so they were going to try to force Detroit to do something about cleaning up the cars. But they lacked some tools, and mostly they lacked any meaningful political support coming from the governor's office at that time. So when Jerry ran, part of his platform was that he was going to clean up the air. And he had a blue skies pledge, and his campaign manager, Tom Quinn, who had grown up in Los Angeles and really had very strong feelings about wanting to do something about the car companies and their flagrant disregard for the health and well-being of the people in California, asked for the job of chair of the Air Resources Board, which up until that time had not been considered to be a political plum appointment. And in fact, it wasn't even a full-time job. He had to get the governor to agree to make him a member of the governor's staff so that he could get a full-time salary. But since it is a board, it had to operate under California rules as a board. So he needed to have two other people at least in order to actually conduct any business. And he needed to have them fit certain criteria that were spelled out in the statute. So one of the positions could be for a lawyer, actually a lawyer, a chemist, or farmer. So I qualified as a lawyer. And another position was for an automotive engineer. And that was Professor Robert Sawyer, who was a very distinguished emeritus professor of combustion engineering.
And it isn't lost on me what you talk about going from Yale to a 4-person male law firm, of which you're the first female. Now you're talking about going to California Air Resources Board. It doesn't sound like there are women all over the place in the Air Resources Board. This sounds like you're elbowing your way into a guy organization.
Well, ARB was essentially an engineering organization, and there were very, very few women engineers at that point. But, I graduated from Yale in 1971. I was a member of the largest cohort of women that they'd ever had. There were 18 of us out of a class of 160, and that was twice as many as they'd ever had. And the only reason for that was the Vietnam War. The law school was facing the fact that a lot of their normal group of guys were going to defer in some way or another to avoid the draft. Or so they needed to fill up the class, and they did it with women.
So at some stage you evolved from CARB. Now this is your NGO time. Now you're helping start the Los Angeles office of the Natural Resources Defense Council. So two questions. I want you to think broadly. What was that like at that stage? And then now, years later, what do you think about the role of NGOs and where it fits in the environmental progressive world?
I joined NRDC to help them start their Los Angeles office because I felt very strongly, and I still do, that Los Angeles was overlooked by the national environmental community. Everybody who had a West Coast office, after they all started on the East Coast, basically, all the big organizations, except for the Sierra Club, which is in a class by itself. It has a different history, but the NGO organizations that were formed in the 70s are all East Coast based. And then after they start to get established, they create an outpost in the West. And it's always in San Francisco, just like all the federal agencies that have a West Coast office have their office in San Francisco, because that's the city and Los Angeles is the Wild West. And they were just wrong about that, I believe. I think they, first of all, just failed to understand that Los Angeles was not this hopeless, smog-bound place. It was a place that had a lot of people in it who actually appreciated and loved the coast and the mountains and the outdoors, and that it was also the fastest growing part of the state and was going to be, and by that time actually already was, politically much more important than San Francisco, which remains a lovely city. I'm very fond of San Francisco, like to visit it, but the power really was in the South, and more to the point, for the organizations that were trying to fund their West Coast operations, the money was in the South. And so NRDC decided to allow one of their lawyers who really wanted to come to Los Angeles to open up an office here. And he came to visit and asked if I'd be willing to serve on their advisory board. And I said, no, but I'll come to work for you. So that was that. They accepted me, and it was wonderful. It was a lot of fun. And during that time, we made some important things happen. We also wrote a book called The Amazing LA Environment, a Handbook for Change, which for the first time in one place explained in sort of ordinary lay people's language where the electricity comes from, where the water comes from, where the sewage goes, all those things that sort of describe the basic the environmental infrastructure of Southern California. And it was a big success, and that helped provide kind of a calling card for NRDC. So that's the past. EDF shortly thereafter started a Los Angeles office, and other groups sprang up. I think we may not have as many groups on the ground as the Bay Area does. In fact, I know we don't. But what Los Angeles has, I think, is a very cohesive environmental community, and also one that has been diverse from day one, not just in terms of having women, but of having people of color as members and as staff members, and as taking on equity issues as a part of their portfolio without even thinking about it, really, other than just, this is what you do. The very first case that the Center for Law and the Public Interest brought in LA, which was when I was just beginning there as a clerk, was a case to stop a freeway called the Century Freeway, which ran through a historically Black community in South LA, and was planned to take out hundreds and hundreds of working class houses and kind of destroy some small cities in order to basically fulfill the visions of the Caltrans engineers of another east-west freeway. And we went out and recruited, essentially, we did recruit the plaintiffs in that case, who were, in addition to the cities that wanted to stop the freeway, we recruited the Sierra Club and the NAACP as co-plaintiffs. And that was just, I mean, that was just the way it was. And, you know, people today act as though it's a new discovery that Black and brown people are disproportionately impacted by all kinds of bad decisions about where to put infrastructure. But it's not new. It's just been rediscovered and hopefully with stronger political backing.
So you're at the opening moments, essentially, of the entire environmental movement, which I still date from about 1970. And by this time, you've already done private practice a bit. You've already been in state government. Now you've been in the NGO. Bill Clinton becomes the president of the United States, and he picks you as the assistant administrator for air. I think this is the first time that I saw you, really. First time I knew of you. I was at Department of Justice then. But you became well known for acid rain and cap and trade programs, some of those things now that we were just hearing about for the first time. Do you look upon that as a building block for some of the things that you've been doing since that time? How did that work being in federal government for the first time?
Uh, I've often said that some of the best people I ever met and worked with were the staff at the air program at EPA. They were really pioneers in many respects, and they were also determined and brave people because although nothing will ever match the kind of assault that Donald Trump made on EPA, they had not always received a high degree of support from administrations in the past either. And the air program has been the tip of the spear for EPA. It's always the thing that gets the most attention because the Clean Air Act is such a powerful piece of legislation, and it contains this marvelous provision that allows for citizen suits. The idea that if you are a citizen, a grieved person anywhere, you can sue the agency to force them to carry out their duties under the law was remarkable. And it has meant that that office has had its agendas set for them in many cases by environmental activist organizations. And so, you know, as the assistant administrator for air, even though I was one of them, I came from the NGO community, I was not spared at all by my colleagues. I was sued on a regular basis, but what we were able to do was to sit down and negotiate and not just you know, not just fight every issue in court, but really try to find ways to comply, which is extremely difficult because the provisions of the law require EPA to do things that they almost never have enough funding or political support to do.
But this is, as I recall, Bill Clinton was a Democrat, which probably means so were you. All of a sudden, Jerry Brown isn't governor any longer, and former bodybuilder movie actor comes in to California, who, as I recall, is a Republican. How does it work that you, as a Democrat in the Clinton administration, go back to California and get picked by a Republican governor to now go back to the California Air Resources Board?
Well, there's a few permutations along the way there, but let's just skip to Arnold. Arnold took office after a recall. Remember, Gray Davis, who had been Jerry Brown's chief of staff and became governor, was recalled shortly after he was elected to his second term. There were a lot of issues at the time, but most people, I think, would agree with me that the recall wouldn't have worked if it hadn't been for the fact that Arnold threw his hat into the ring and agreed to become the candidate for governor. So all of a sudden you had a movie star, a celebrity, who vowed to change everything and had an image that was, went along with the idea that he was going to come in there and break up all the bad stuff in Sacramento and return power to the people, et cetera. And the fact of the matter is that he didn't succeed in doing a lot of the things that he set out to do and wanted to do, some of which were impossible because of structural issues like the way the tax system works, and some of which, just turned out to be too heavy a lift. But it turned out that, and I think this is something that I wish more Republicans, agreed with him. There are a few, and hopefully there are getting to be more. But he completely failed to get the memo that said, if you're a Republican, you have to be against environmental protection. In fact, he thought that the issue was completely nonpartisan. He had what I think of as kind of a European attitude about the government's responsibility to provide a healthy environment. He was and is a passionate lover of the state of California and all of its wonderful resources. And he wanted to, have a state that was leading the way in environmental protection. He understood that global warming was a global issue. And again, California is a state that doesn't just compare itself against other states. It also looks to the world as its benchmark for things. And so when the Democrats in the legislature started to make noises about passing a comprehensive bill on climate change, he welcomed it. He negotiated for a couple of things that he wanted, but the main thing he negotiated for was the ability to have a market-based program, a cap and trade program, as a tool, if not the principal tool, for achieving the goals of reaching the same levels of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions as the Kyoto Treaty. So the statute that he signed, AB 32, is a pretty slim piece of legislation, but it commits the state to being a party, in effect, to the global agreement on how much reduction there needed to be to deal with the problem of global warming, and created a program to make that happen, basically a mandate for the state to achieve those reductions, building on what the state had already done in terms of requiring reductions in emissions from vehicles. So they first passed a law that said ARB had to set limits on GHG emissions from cars. And then after that came the Comprehensive Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, as it's called. But anyway, that was Arnold's bill. So my predecessor, Bob Sawyer, same guy who I had served with under Jerry Brown, got crosswise with the governor. It's I don't think anybody will ever know entirely what transpired between the two of them, but the governor just didn't think that Bob had the same kind of political view of all of this that he did, or that he was going to be able to carry out this piece of legislation, which, like many other things, once, even before the ink was dry, people were fighting over what it meant and how it was going to be implemented and how much it was going to cost. And he ended up firing him sort of at the last, it was a midnight firing kind of situation. There was all kinds of consternation in the legislature. The Democrats immediately seized on it to say, see, we told you so. He didn't really mean it. He doesn't really care about this at all. And the governor's chief of staff had to go out looking for somebody who would come in and take over the board and rescue this program, which was the governor's signature program. So she called me and asked me if I knew of anybody. And I said, yeah, me. So this is another example of, stick up your hand and you get chosen. So in fact, that was what happened. It was not quite that simple. I did have to actually be interviewed for the job by the governor, who had lots of questions. But when he found out that I'd been responsible for the acid rain program and had already run a cap and trade program, in fact, the only cap and trade program up to that point that had ever been operated at the federal level, that seemed to seal the deal.
Mary, our audience is across the world right now, people listening to you. Many of them are experienced and would know what the California Air Resources Board do because it's such a unique agency, but many do not. Would you just take a minute and let the audience know just a snapshot of why that organization would be so extraordinarily important in something like the climate bill, implementing it for California?
Sure. Well, California Air Resources Board was created to deal with the problem of smog, which persists but has been dramatically reduced over time as a result of regulations that the board has adopted. So, over the course of several decades, first by setting strong standards based on science, and then by taking steps to mandate the car companies, the manufacturers of engines, people who operate power plants and refineries and any other major sources of pollution have been subjected to the regulatory power that the board has. And over the years, the board ends up getting new members. So it's what started as a 5-member board is now a 14-member board with 2 ex officio legislators who don't vote but sit on the board representing the Assembly and the State Senate. The board gets overseen and audited and otherwise critiqued, but they also keep being given more authority because it turns out to have been a very competent agency in terms of actually getting things done. So CARB is one of those fairly rare, I think, bureaucratic agencies, which under both Republicans and Democrats has not only survived, but enjoyed a great deal of support. And I have to say that support from the regulated community, as well as from, the more populist elements of the society, is also an important factor, because you have to have the people who are actually, creating jobs and running the economy have to be willing to not just go along, but support good regulation. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that, when Governor Schwarzenegger signed AB 32, the organization that probably deserves most of the credit, at least co-equal with the green groups, would be the Silicon Valley business organizations that came in and lobbied because they believed that by having a strong first in the nation program that mandated California to be out front in trying to address the problem of global warming, California would also benefit, and they would benefit because they would be able to sell their inventions or their investment companies they were investing in all over the world.
So if AB 32 represents pretty much the first of its kind of a comprehensive market-driven program to reduce greenhouse gases, it was enormously controversial. People outside of California thought the economy of California would now fall apart completely. Ultimately, there is a recall. How did you go about that? How were you implementing something that was that controversial at a time where this was all new? It was absolutely new.
Well, first of all, I need to clarify that the market-based program that the governor wanted did make it into our final plan, and it is in effect today, but it is not the principal tool for reducing greenhouse gases in California. We developed a comprehensive plan that contains a portfolio of measures, and the measures that achieve the largest reductions, that were designed to achieve the largest reductions, were things like the automotive standards, the low carbon fuel standard, which is a model in its own right and something that's just now really being looked at seriously at the federal level as a way to clean up the vehicle fuel supply and to create incentives for people to invent newer, cleaner kinds of fuels. The reason why it worked was because it was a mix of measures and not just any one thing that we were, and the reason why we did it that way wasn't just because we were politically smart, although I think we were, but it was mostly that we thought that would be the most cost-effective and durable way of actually getting to the levels of reductions that we needed to meet the requirements of the law. And as it has turned out, and it's been looked at now by quite a number of economists, not all of whom started out favorably disposed towards the California program, people generally have agreed that this mix of different measures was the best that we could have done to achieve that result.
Lessons for us now, that experiment, that experience that you have now as we face an existential crisis right now with greenhouse gases. What do we learn from your experience of, bringing AB 32 into reality?
Again, I think one of the most important lessons to be learned from this is that there is no single magic bullet. There's a lot of buckshot out there, and you have to try a lot of things. You have to be prepared to set ambitious goals that you're not sure how you're going to achieve, but that are based on the science that exists that tells you what you need to have. And this is a lesson from the Clean Air Act, going back to the very beginning, where air quality standards were set based on not what we thought was doable, but based on what you need to have if you're going to prevent the air from making people sick. So you set levels of reduction, your goals, based on what the science tells you you've got to have, and then you devise a plan that will get you to it, understanding that some of the things that you try are not going to work. Others may work better than you thought they were going to, and you have to have the ability to be flexible and to make changes along the way that keep you moving towards the goal.
Well, one of the criticisms along the way of greenhouse gas reductions in general is that we'll do all this domestically, but there won't be enough of an international coalition, so that and this is a global problem, not just a national problem. But that was not lost on you either, was it? You went to Canada. You were at the Paris Accords. How did you see California's role when you're talking to foreign countries, and were they responsive? Well, did you feel that it was more than just us that was trying to make these changes?
This goes back again to Governor Schwarzenegger, who I have to give credit for positioning California on the global stage. And he took advantage of his celebrity as a movie star to go to the Conference of Parties, or if he didn't go himself, to send a delegation and to hold up California's example as one that would give encouragement and help to recruit others from around the globe. So under Schwarzenegger and then under Jerry Brown, this amplified enormously. We actually created a coalition of subnationals, as they're called. Not a very lovely term, but it covers states and regions. And we have now, international associations of cities, all of which have not only made pledges and said, yeah, we want to do something, but are actually taking very concrete, specific steps and supporting each other and holding up each other's work. And when we go to the international UN conferences, even though we are not parties, we're not allowed in the room where the official delegates are negotiating the language that will be in their treaties or accords or agreements, but the side events, as they're called, and the work that's being done there is every bit as important and is in fact now considered essential to the national governments that are trying to work their way towards a global agreement, because they can't do this job without the support of the sub-national entities that are in every part of the world, the place where most of the decisions about land use development, most of the decisions about where the electricity is going to come from in a particular facility or a particular region. Many of the decisions about, are you going to be mining, are you going to be developing oil, et cetera, are made at the local and regional level. And the political support to do this stuff comes from there, literally the ground up.
I'm about to move you back into where you started us out. You started it out saying, I'm in Los Angeles and we have air problems. It's largely cars. Uh, Now I'm moving you toward the Obama administration, and we're coming out of the recession. And it turns out that California has somewhat unique authority in cars and vehicle standards that other states you can either emulate or not. And now looking at ways that we can impact greenhouse gas issues, trying to do that and marry together two disparate agencies of EPA and the National Transportation Safety Administration. And you're there because part of the leverage of getting them together is the so-called California cars. What are those, Mary? What are California cars, and how did that work? How are you playing in that historical compromise that occurred early on in the Obama administration that really did have an impact on transportation?
So your question sort of assumes the fact that I'll just say again that the reason why California occupies the unique position that it does in the national debate about auto standards, cars and trucks and other mobile sources is that the Federal Clean Air Act, the 1970 Clean Air Act, gave us authority which no other state has. The industry wanted complete preemption. They wanted one set of standards at the federal level. This is what industries always want. They don't want to have to negotiate state by state. But California refused to go along with the Clean Air Act, and we had a big delegation then, as we do now, if it meant giving up their authority, because they knew that the federal standards were never going to be as strong as what California would want. California's pollution problem was worse. California was willing to be an experimenter in pushing for better design and better technology from vehicles. And so that was what they held out for. Ronald Reagan fought for that, as has every other governor of the state. Pete Wilson, again, Democrats, Republicans, every time this issue has come up, have insisted that California maintain the right. And again, instead of just maintaining, over the years, the law has actually afforded other states the ability to opt into the California standards if they want to. So we now have 40% plus of the United States, which by law require the California standards rather than the national standards. Every once in a while, the two actually catch up with each other. And this is what happened when Obama was elected. When it became clear that it was quite likely that he would be the next president, the auto industry actually came to us, came to me. And by that time, we all knew each other fairly well, and said, we would like to find a way to get California on board with a national program whereby we would agree to enough reductions in pollution, in emissions, that California could accept that as being the equivalent of having your own standards, so that in effect, there would be a national standard and California would agree while not giving up its standards, although they would have preferred that we give them up, but we didn't do that. But we said we would accept the compliance with the federal standards as being the equivalent of compliance with the California standards. You, as a lawyer, are, I'm sure, thinking, how did they do this? And it's complicated. I mean, the actual regulatory agreement that we made is complicated, but it's workable, and it has worked to achieve the result, which is that cars that are sold in the United States as a group, as a class, have met the California standards for greenhouse gas emissions. And so we were able to move the whole country forward. But that was because President Obama insisted that EPA give California the waiver that we've been fighting for to keep our own standards, and then had his EPA and DOT sit down with us under White House supervision and negotiate this set of standards that covered both fuel economy and greenhouse gas emissions. So it was an incredible piece of lawyering, and a lot of very, very smart, good people worked on it. But it couldn't have happened without the recognition on the part of the industry that this was something that they needed to come up with a way to go along with as well. And that's probably one of the reasons why we felt so betrayed when after President Trump took office, the industry went to him and said they wanted relief from those very standards that they had negotiated not so long before.
So we have a whole administration where California is held out as a model of greenhouse gas reductions, as a model of reducing transportation problems, and not just greenhouse gas, it was also reducing nitrogen oxide and particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, and others. And then all of a sudden, a new president comes in. This transportation was not the only issue that you were fighting through in the Trump administration. What was that like, going from being a leader in the area and all of a sudden being a defendant in cases?
Well, we weren't mostly a defendant. We fought most of the lawsuits ourselves, and we had a strategy which was agreed upon at the very beginning, that if we were going to save the Clean Air Act and save California's program and our vision of how the world should work, that we were going to have to not accept. We were just going to have to stand against anything that that the Trump administration wanted to put up that was going to weaken any aspect of environmental law. And so we filed dozens and dozens of cases, not ever all by ourselves. We always had other states or NGOs or both. Sometimes we had industry coalitions with us as well. But we were determined that we were just not going to let them get away with anything. And we had a wonderful Attorney General, Javier Becerra, now President Biden's choice for running the Health and Human Services Program, to represent us in all this litigation, and a governor, of course, who was happy to be part of it.
I want to turn to one particular type of vehicles. It was toward the end of 2015. I had been leading the negotiations against BP for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and it wasn't public, but we had pretty much finished all the negotiations, and we just are inking the last bit of the consent decree. And I get a call from Cynthia Giles, who was then head of the Office of Enforcement, who said pretty much, "You're not going to believe what Mary Nichols just told me," something to that effect. And it was Volkswagen. It was,
okay.
it was Volkswagen.
Where's it going?
It's, that's what it is. And because I think all Volkswagen, broke through you all there. Talk about that. Talk about how that happened, and then how this whole thing started, the beginning. And I think we were all surprised at those early moments.
Well, first of all, I do think it's important to remember that EPA and California in good times and bad. That is, when we've disagreed and when we haven't, then when we have been in agreement about everything from a policy perspective, both have been committed to sharing the burden of enforcing clean air regulations. And our laboratory and their laboratory share information on a regular basis. And we've divided up some of the work of enforcement, where EPA took most of the responsibility for the heavy duty engines because they had better testing capacity. And we took a larger share of work on the light duty vehicles, the passenger cars and light trucks. And so when California uncovered the cheating that was going on by Volkswagen, that information was shared immediately with EPA. And in the end, as you know, because you were the chief of our negotiating team, the federal presence, the federal power was key. I mean, California couldn't have achieved what we did all by ourselves. So I need to acknowledge you in that respect as well, and EPA, our colleagues at EPA. But as it happened, it was people that were working with California who were the ones who both figured out that there was something wrong because the measurements that we were getting in the lab and on the road were so different from the certification data that we had from Volkswagen for these diesel vehicles. And so we knew there was something amiss. And when the company actually confessed, one of their officials explained what they had been doing, it was California that received that information. And so we were the first to go forward with it. But it was the enforcement effort was a joint effort. The mechanism that the company had used to avoid compliance was not all that it's sophisticated, I guess, in the sense that it relies on the fact that you can manipulate software to decide what the vehicle is actually going to do at any given point while it's being operated. And so they were able to come up with a system that basically defeated the emissions control system when the car was actually in use. And that produced amazingly high fuel economy. Really, is great in terms of making the cars operate at much better than, the norm that people expect, which is that the numbers that you see on the sticker are, much better than what you achieve in the real world when you get a new car. In the case of these diesel vehicles, it was the opposite. People were getting better fuel economy, and so they were totally happy. And that was one of the reasons why we were concerned going into this enforcement action, is that, the customers who had purchased these vehicles were going to say, wait a minute, what do we care? Okay, so it may not be meeting its emission standards, but hey, we're getting great fuel economy. And so it was, I think, one of the things about this whole enforcement case that I'm happiest about in many ways is that we were able to succeed in keeping the support of the public behind us and saying, it's not okay to cheat on your smog tests, that you actually, this matters, because that wasn't obvious at the beginning that would be how it would all work out in the end. Anyway, it was a long negotiation, many meetings, changes in the company's team along the way. But of course, the thing that happened that's really the most amazing about this story is that after all the bad publicity and after all the money that they had to pay in penalties as damages, et cetera, the company transformed itself. And they really are a different company than they were when we first started down this path, because their own government, which had been pretty lax, if not actually encouraging of, Volkswagen's attitudes, what they could get away with, came down hard on them, and their own leadership decided that if they were going to maintain their success and go on to survive as a global manufacturer, they were going to have to do something different. And they did, and they've turned themselves into now a competitor, a contender for one of the leading, if not the leading, manufacturer and marketer of zero emission vehicles in the world.
So the audience will not know this, but I'll tell you anyway, and that is Mary was talking about the negotiations, which were largely done at the Department of Justice, but there was never a time where either Mary was not sitting right with me or her general counsel was not sitting with me, and would not have happened, not just without California, but without those individuals. But one of the issues that you put your finger on, and your stamp is very clear in that settlement, that when Attorney General Loretta Lynch announced it, she announced it as the largest settlement of its type in the history of the government, was zero emission vehicles, promoting zero emission vehicles, not just in California, but across the nation. Have you seen that play out locally? Have you seen that as being a beneficial issue, that settlement aspect of it?
Absolutely. Shortly after we settled the cases, Volkswagen spun off a company that was created to comply with the settlement, and they were under an obligation to file a plan that showed exactly how they were going to achieve the levels of investment that the agreement called for. And it started off, I suppose, a little bit shaky, but pretty quickly developed into a relationship where people in California at the local level, within the city of Sacramento, within the legislature, understood that we were going to be the recipients of the largest investment ever in vehicle electrification, and that this was a rare opportunity to accomplish something that California had been trying to do for years. And so people came up with all kinds of ideas and suggestions and matching funds and programs to assist in the effort to really make this place a leader in electric transportation. And it's built from there.
So to our EarthX audience, I hope you now appreciate why I started out telling you that this is a great honor for me to talk with and present questions to a hero of mine, to the people who put this together, Trammell Crow and Bruce Fogarty and Jeff Simmons and others. Thank you for giving us the chance to show to you the Queen of Green, to show you the most influential environmental regulator in history, my friend, somebody I deeply admire, Mary Nichols. Mary, thank you so much for being
It's been a pleasure.
our person today.
Thanks so much.